Hello and welcome to The Collective's first filmed interview. And I'm really happy that my first guest, or our first guest actually, is Bogart.
I'm happy to be your first guest.
So I woke up this morning and I remembered a story I'd heard about Peter Brook. And so Peter Brook had this gathering, this masterclass of directors, of British directors. And he turned to the room and he said, you know, I always keep thinking about my family, my early formative experiences and how it influenced my work. And I'm just wondering, have you had that experience as well? And so one director turned around and said, well, actually, my dad was an architect. And so that when I'm looking at a play or doing a new production, I have the drawings, which are the play, and then I'm building this production and going room by room by room, and then I assemble it. And then another director said, well, my father was an archaeologist, and so when I'm excavating the play and I'm digging down into it, and we as the cast and the designers are all digging down and we're uncovering new layers. And so we went around the room to all of the directors, and then they all turned to Peter Brook and they said, what about you? And he said, my father made laxatives.
That's funny.
So when you go into a room and you've written viewpoints, which I think is such an extraordinary text, and I have been in the room with you, watching viewpoints and experiencing viewpoints. When you go into the room, what are you thinking about on that first day?
Well, you know, since you brought up people's upbringing, I'll tell you that my family was in the Navy. Mm-hmm. All of them. All my uncles were in the Navy. My father, my mother, all of my aunts were naval wives, and I was expected to become a naval wife. So we moved every year. And the theater was a place where I could be dumped into some big school and find a group of actors or just a group of school kids. Mm-hmm. We could make things really fast, put them up, we'd all fall in love with each other, and then it was over. Mm-hmm. That was just like my life, because we moved every year. So it was something I was gravitated to. But to go to the laxative issue, my grandfather was a naval admiral, and he was he was my mother's father. His name was Spruance, and he was put in charge of the Pacific Fleet during the Second World War and is credited for winning the Battle of Midway. Mm-hmm. You can find him on the cover of Time magazine for having done that. And he was known as a great strategist. Mm-hmm. And he would fall asleep during battles. And people would come to the door and say, knock, knock, knock. He'd say, excuse me, Admiral, the Japanese have sunk a submarine, and so what should we do? And he'd wake up and he'd say, why did you wake me up? And they'd say, but Admiral, the submarine is sunk. And he'd say, well, you know what to do. We've been through it all. He was a great strategist. And I feel the same way about directing. It's like you don't stop the play in the middle of the play and say, director, what should we do? Mm-hmm. So I would say in that story you're telling is that what I inherited was strategy. Mm-hmm. And I work on strategy with actors so that they then take over the strategy. So what I'm looking for and what drew me to the viewpoints in the first place is that it's a way of working in which the actors don't turn to the director and say, what should I do now? Mm-hmm. Or what do you want? Is that there's a strategy and a plan and they know what to do and they go after it. So when I go into a room with actors, as is happening now with these wonderful Irish actors we're working with, I'm trying to create a circumstance in which they are doing the creating and I am doing the editing. Mm-hmm. And so it's all about strategy, just like my grandfather. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I mean, working with these Irish actors this week on Eastland, the play that the Collective is going to do next year, and you're directing it. It's interesting watching how actors are offered their own, and I hate using this word, but I think it's the right word in this case, their own sense of agency and their own sense of responsibility, that they're given a strategy and then how they choose to implement that strategy is still left up to them. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it allows for accident. And it allows for improvisation and it allows for spontaneity. So there's this real sense of playfulness and a sense of adventure.
I think agency is exactly the right word. But it's funny, working with you, we've worked together how many years, Jocelyn?
Since 96, so 26 years.
That's a long time. And we've done a lot of shows together. But it's true that whenever an accident happens, you usually say, oh, that's just what I was thinking was going to happen. And whether that's true or not, it's kind
Most
of
of the time it is.
That's what I was thinking. You say that more than anybody I've ever met. Which is actually a fantastic strategy in terms of, I think of often the great American filmmaker Robert Altman, who said in an interview once, he said, think of one of my films and think of the 5 things that you like best about the film. I can guarantee they were accidents. He said that what he does is he gets together people who he believes in, both crew and actors, creates a circumstance, the conditions, and then waits for accidents to occur. So I think with this play, we're going to discover a lot through accident.
Well, we're already discovering a lot through accident. And yeah, I mean, I know that increasingly I'm interested in accidents. I'm interested in things that fall out of people's pockets when they're talking or when they're doing something. And so when I'm, as a dramaturg, people say, what do you do as a dramaturg? And I say, I just ask lots and lots of questions. And the reason I'm asking lots of questions is, A, because I want to know. But really, I want the playwrights to keep digging around, and then things will fall out. I mean, ultimately, the playwright's going to write the play, but I want the things to fall out and they go, oh, look, I didn't know that was there. And pick it up, and I think I can do something with this. And I remember working with Taylor Mack on his show, and he kept saying perfection is for assholes. And I was like, that is so true. Our desire to make something perfect rules out the possibility of accident and induces panic when something unexpected happens.
But you're the playwright now. You're the dramaturg and the playwright. But and I think it's influenced somewhat by your work with Taylor Mack, but you're really interested in what the audience is doing almost as much as what the actors are doing.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing that when we started working together, it's like we both ask the same questions about the audience. What is happening for the audience? Generally, when we think about audiences, it's like a big mouth breathing in the dark with a big eye. And you were one of the first people I met who really actually was interested in what's going on in each individual audience member. And I've always thought that, a theatre piece, whether it's a play, whether it's a devised production, must hold every single person in that theatre in some way, shape or form. And so that the audience is always interesting to me and what that experience is. And I think even now more than ever after the pandemic, is like that becomes increasingly important. And then by extension, this idea of community.
Yeah. Also how the audience is breathing and how they breathe with the actors. But my favorite incident, I would call this, that I think can illuminate what you're talking about, came in an interview with the great pianist Alfred Brendel, who's known for his Beethoven sonatas. And he said that when he's playing a sonata in concert, he'll get to the moment before the final chord, he'll raise his hands and silently ask the audience how long they'll let him, agency, wait before he plays the final chord. When I read that, I literally screamed. It was in an interview. And I said, that's it. That's why I do theater, is that. So it's a sacred relationship, a circular one. I'm interested in how actors learn from audiences learn from actors, audiences learn from each other. Actors learn from each other. Like, what is the circular nature of the theater? Which is why I'll probably never do a film, because it's just too interesting to me what happens in a room, which is why I was particularly frustrated during COVID period.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting that, it's how do you rebuild and reconstruct community while on Zoom? And, people are saying, I miss the liveness and we're not in the same room, but how can you actually reimagine Zoom as a larger room? And on one level you can't. But the one thing that it struck me about was about access. That for the first time ever, people in different places could actually access work.
I know so many people who run art centers and theaters who said they lost their local audiences and gained an international one. And I think it behooves us to figure out how to use that connection, how to find partners around the world for what we're doing. So that's a question. And so as much as I am frustrated, and in the beginning of COVID, I joked because I used to call theater breathing common air. And do you remember how dangerous it was to breathe common air? You and I are talking together now. It's not a problem, but I remember those first months thinking, I remember holding my breath when I would pass people on the street when I was walking the dog in London. I was terrified of breathing common air. So
there was that mayor in California when he was asked, what were you doing when you were standing beside that man without wearing a mask? He said, I was holding my breath all the time and I didn't breathe the air, not once. Yeah. So this year is a special year for you because it's the year that the City Company is finishing. And this was something which was really radical, which was that you signaled 3 or 4 years ago, the company signaled that we will be closing in 3 years. And the current configuration of the company is really interesting to me because it's similar to the collective, and we stumbled into it by accident. And I'm curious about, you have 3 artistic directors. So how has that been for you?
Well, first of all, to address the first part of what you're talking about, what made us decide not to continue after 30 years is, you said, either we are an institution or we're a company of people, a group of people. If we're an institution, we need to get new artistic leadership. We need to find new actors. We need to diversify the company in a huge way. There's a lot to do. But after a lot of debate and discussion, it was decided, actually, no, we're not an institution. We're a group of people who came together 30 years ago and thought we'd last maybe 10. And so, to me, the idea of us just sort of fizzling out seemed to be a bad idea. I wanted to sort of accelerate towards a big celebration. We made the decision just before Trump was elected, and as soon as Trump was elected, the company stood up and said, no, we're not ending, we can't, it's too important what we're doing. Anyway, eventually they came around again to let's go till we finish our 30th year. But the reason we chose shared artistic leadership is because it actually reflects how we work in the room together. That for years I was the artistic director, I think Ellen Lauren was the associate artistic director, and so that top-down hierarchy didn't really reflect the work that was going on. And so we decided that 3 would be a good number. 3 is a perfect number for artistic leadership, I think, because you have the balance of points of view. I mean, and then much as in a rehearsal, each one of us brings different talents. I think a lot about projects we want to do. Ellen thinks about the care of the company. Leon thinks about technology and how we can incorporate it. And so we somehow disagree enough to be productive together. It's a good, I think threesomes are really good.
I think so. And we have found that, in the last couple of years, is because the great thing is that there was always somebody there to carry other things if you drop something. But there's always somebody there that you can have a conversation with and actually think about an idea and explore an idea. And a healthy disagreement is great. Actually, it's not about having a mindset, but everyone has different points of view, and then you come to a new thing that is co-created as an idea that everyone shares and everyone stands behind. And so I think that for us, we've been together now as the collective for the last 2 years. It's really beneficial, and I can't imagine it being any other way.
Yeah.
But this idea of an institution, I mean, I think that's one of the things that struck me in the last couple of years is how institutions either succeeded during the pandemic or failed. And now that we're coming towards the tail end of the pandemic, and that's not to in any way diminish the fact that COVID is still present with us, but it's interesting how a lot of organizations are changing leadership and how they have to reimagine themselves in new contexts and the resistance to that.
Yeah. We're in a moment of massive cultural change, and political and economic and environmental, and a realization of if we don't adjust and change the assumptions we've had for so many years, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble anyway, so how are we going to function with that? And so, yes, in the States, certainly the leadership changes are massive. And What I always worry about is that is a sort of Bolshevik tendency, which is that if you go so far, you become restrictive of an agency becomes an issue again.
Mm-hmm.
But I just think it is a moment of huge change. I have to question the words I've been using for my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
And my posture in the world,
mm-hmm.
and so much. Anyway, is that where you were going with this?
I was actually, because that's the thing that's interesting to me at the moment, is that there are people's own personal resistances to being challenged, to being interrogated, to being asked.
Well, that's but all of us have that in us. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
I mean, in me, I suddenly think if we're talking about the way we change language, I'm thinking, God damn it. I've told these jokes my whole life, and they're good jokes. I don't want to change. I think all of us have that, but then you have to deal with that resistance, right? Well, what's that about, and why are you hanging on to old ways of being?
But I find myself arguing with people about gender pronouns, and I get the argument which is like, I don't know why I have to change. Like, why is it changing?
Right.
Actually change.
Yeah.
Actually do it and see what happens. Because what happens for me personally is that my brain goes, it dilates and it opens up. And so I'm just fascinated at this moment because I do think we're at this interesting moment of change and interrogation about how do we use it and really ask fundamental questions. I mean, I was joking about Peter Brook earlier on, but the really amazing thing about the empty space is that he stripped theatre down and said, what is it? What is that act of theatre? And I remember you and I talking about it a few years ago, and we said, you need a third person, that you need someone to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah. And that's who you are in many ways. I mean, you talk about, you're unusual as a dramaturg, writer, collaborator, is that you do both. You're very much in the room and very much responsive, but you also are able to theorize, which is your dramaturgical training, which I value.
Yeah, which I enjoy as well.
Yeah. But you can be brutal.
Well, I don't know if I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah, you can be brutal.
Yeah, but it's interesting.
Yeah, but you can be brutal.
But it's interesting. There's this very famous, people keep saying it to me, which is, I always get tense when you say, I have a question. So poor Niall Henry in the Blue Raincoats says, when he hears, I have a question, and I genuinely have a question, he's like, uh-oh, we're in trouble. And so as you say, it's like, I can be brutal. I don't intend to be brutal. But I'm genuinely into like, what is this?
Yeah.
What is happening? How is it happening? And there are traditions.
What's threatening is that you're such a smart guy that everybody else feels stupid. In a way, it's not a negative thing. You're very, very quick to think things through faster than most of us. I'm pretty slow. So
I completely disagree with that. I mean, it was interesting because I always sit in rooms with you and I come out the better for it in terms of my thinking about something or my feeling about something. I come out bouncing. And it was interesting, we have our stage manager and we couldn't find a stage manager. So we have a young man, 18 years old, who has never
related to you, darling.
Related to me, my nephew. And he has never been in a room full of actors. And watching his complete transformation over the last few days, that this is possible, and listening to these conversations and the stories that we tell each other about this. And we're doing a piece about a ship that capsized and nobody remembers, and yet more passengers died than the Titanic. And how do we forget? And so all of those conversations, you see his brain going fizz, 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 fizz. And that to me is me.
He is you.
He is me. When I come out of your room, I'm going like fizz, 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 and I'm 18 years old. I mean, it was really shocking to me to realize that we have known each other for 26 years. We have done, I think, 10 pieces together. Yeah. But if you ask me what's the sense of our relationship, it's like 2 years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my job as a director is to create the politics of a room, is to create the conditions, or to do nothing short of creating a model society. Because when an audience goes to see a play, they actually see two plays. They're seeing the play, but they're also seeing how these actors are functioning together. So we create a a way for actors to express not only the characters they're playing and the situation, but how they interrelate, is a proposal to the world of how the world might function together. So that's my job. But I also think part of my job, which is why it's not a bad thing that you're really smart and I'm kind of stupid, is that as I either listen to the play or watch something, I feel no compunction about, I don't understand anything. Wait, go back. I don't get it. Or what's this? Or what? So I find it really helpful because I get really lost at moments, and I can turn to you and say, Jocelyn, could you unpack this for me? And you do right away.
And then I also change it in response to that question.
You certainly do.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is not working, or this is not clear, or the fact, I mean, I'm always asking that question. The three questions I always ask as a dramaturg, even when I'm watching a show, or if I'm working on a show, or if I'm working with a writer, is like, what is happening? How is it happening? And then why is it happening? And why is it happening in this way as opposed to any other way? And then you enter into that territory of, is this actually necessary? And if it's not necessary, then are there other ways of looking at something?
Well, then I want to pick up on the why right now, because I think it's interesting. And I know the actors ask, as we're doing this week of workshops with Eastland, why this play now? And I'm going to turn that to you right now. Why this play now?
It's interesting to me, a couple of things. One is I'm curious about how we forget and why we forget. And therefore, who gets to tell the story? Who gets to keep the memory? And who do we exclude and keep out of that memory? And so the Eastland is a ship that, by all rights, should be really well known given it was such a horrendous tragedy, and yet it's not. So why is this story being neglected? Why is this story being forgotten? Why is this story being dismissed or buried? And so then it becomes, who gets to keep the memory? What is the official memory? What is a public memory? And what is a private memory? And so this story about this boat was that it was erased, more or less, within years of it happening. And then it was only by the persistence of small communities, and small communities being small families, and individuals in those families telling this story about what happened, and you have to remember. It then has gradually emerged, almost 100 years later, as a story that we need to talk about. And so that is interesting to me in terms of this is why, and who gets to remember, and what do we get to remember. And I was thinking about this on the way down, in the sunshine, is that we are experiencing in Ireland at the moment. And I am so happy that you are here working with Irish actors finally. Do you know what I mean? And we get to make a piece in Ireland for Irish audiences. We are going through a period of commemoration. And so it's a decade of commemorations. And so we are telling the official story of ourselves, or the state is telling an official story, but we're also telling other kinds of stories, and different communities are telling different stories. And there is competitions.
Why is that happening now?
Because there were significant events from beginning in 1913 was the lockout, when all of the factory owners locked out their workers, and the lockout lasted for 6 months with devastating social and economic consequences. And it essentially destroyed any possibility of a significant trade union movement for many, many years. And then we go through 1916 is the Irish Rebellion, and then 1921 is the War of Independence, and now 22 is the Civil War, and so all of these are significant events. And you think, on one level, some people think it's 100 years ago, it doesn't matter, but actually the responses to some of the commemorations mean it is, because it is competing versions of who we are, how we are, where we were, and why are we the way we are now, and how those narratives, those memories, exclude certain communities, exclude certain traditions, and only privilege others. And so the Eastland seemed to me like, oh, this is a way of talking about that.
Yeah, it's a lens.
It's a lens to look at that.
Well, we're going through exactly the same, in different ways, in the States, about what are the stories that haven't been told. And that word iconic is interesting, that the Titanic sinking became an iconic event from which books and movies were made and musicals were made, and the Eastland didn't. And is it because it was mostly immigrants on that ship and blue-collar workers on that ship? And again, whose stories are we telling? I like to think that we're at the end of postmodernism. I grew up as a postmodernist, and so I deconstructed. That's what I did as a young director. I took plays and busted them apart. But I feel like we've gotten to the end of postmodernism, the end of deconstruction. And the question now is, what are the stories we tell? Whose stories are they? For whom? Who tells them? I mean, it's a little related to what you're saying. And so what you're saying about Ireland, I think, is also true in the States, which is why I think the Eastland piece should come to the States.
Oh, I think so too. I think it'd be a blast.
Yeah.
And Bogart, thank you so much.
Good.
Is that right?